Rain drummed against the roof of Simon's taxi as he drove through the dimly lit streets of Hong Kong. He was on his usual night shift, cruising through the city's maze of roads, looking for fares. It was a lonely job, but Simon was used to it. He had been a taxi driver for over a decade, and he had seen all kinds of passengers during that time. As he cruised through Kowloon Street, Simon scanned the sidewalks for potential passengers. He noticed a girl waving at him from the side of the road. She was standing in the rain, with her long black hair matted to her face and her clothes clinging to her skin. Simon felt a pang of sympathy for her and pulled over to offer her a ride. "Hey there, do you need a lift?" he called out to her through the open window. The girl looked up, revealing her striking features. Her eyes were dark and piercing, and her skin was a pale shade of white that made her look almost ghostly. She nodded her head, implying a yes to the question. Simon unlocked the door, and the girl climbed into the backseat. He turned on the meter and pulled back onto the road, beginning the first of many journeys with his mysterious passenger. As they drove through the city, Simon tried to make conversation with the girl. He asked her where she was going, but she remained silent, gazing out of the window at the rain-drenched streets. "Is everything okay?" Simon asked, concerned by her quiet demeanor. The girl turned to look at him, her eyes glittering in the dim light of the taxi. She nodded again without saying anything. Then she continued to gaze out of the window. Simon shrugged and continued driving, the sound of the rain drumming on the roof of the car. After a few minutes, they arrived at the address the woman had given him on a piece of paper. It was a derelict apartment in a quiet back street, surrounded by trees and darkness. "Here we are," Simon said, coming to a stop in front of the apartment. The woman paid him in cash, handing him a generous tip before stepping out of the taxi. Simon watched as she walked up to the front door of the apartment and disappeared inside. As he drove away from the place, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just met someone who would change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. Little did he know, he was about to embark on a journey that would take him to the edge of his sanity and beyond. Simon continued to pick up the mysterious girl for the next few nights. She always appeared in the same spot, standing in the rain with her eyes fixed on the ground. Simon couldn't help but wonder what her story was, why she was always alone and where she was going. As usual, Simon would try to strike up conversations with the girl, asking her about herself and her life. But she always remained quiet, staring out of the window with an unreadable expression on her face. She will always drop off at the same apartment, giving a huge generous tip before she goes. On the seventh day morning, Simon sat in a local coffee shop, sipping his morning tea and reading the newspaper after he had just finished his night shift. And then he saw it, a small article buried on the third page. Young woman found dead in an alleyway near Kowloon Street 7 days ago. Ex-boyfriend is the main suspect still at large. Simon's heart raced as he read on, his worst fears confirmed. The woman he had been driving around for the past week was dead, murdered by someone in the alleyway where he always picked her up. The details were sketchy, but the article mentioned that the woman had been identified as Jean, a bar host from a nearby establishment. He felt a chill run down his spine as he read about how Jean had been found dead in an alley, her body battered and bruised. The article went on to say that her ex-boyfriend was the prime suspect, but he had disappeared without a trace. He couldn't believe that he had been driving a ghost around the city for the past week, and that he had been so close to danger without even realizing it. Simon's mind was consumed with thoughts of the murdered woman, Jean. He couldn't believe that he had been driving her ghost around the city, completely oblivious to her true nature. During his night shift, while the rain heavily poured outside, Simon decided to take a break and rest in his taxi for a while. Suddenly, the radio went silent, and after a few seconds, a scratchy and distorted voice started speaking. It was Jean's voice. "Come and find me, Simon," the voice said repeatedly. Simon was shocked and tried to turn off the radio, but it wouldn't turn off. The voice kept echoing in his mind, urging him to find her. Simon felt compelled to go to the spot where he always picked up Jean. As he drove to the location, The radio finally stopped. He got out of the taxi and started making his way towards the dark alley. Despite his better judgment, he found himself drawn to the alleyway, and soon, he was standing in the same spot where Jean's lifeless body had been found. A chill ran down his spine as he looked around, taking in the dingy walls and dirty pavement. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jean's ghost was still lingering in the area, seeking some kind of justice or closure. Suddenly, Simon heard a faint whisper in the wind. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then he heard it again, a soft, sad voice that seemed to be calling out for help. "Who's there?" Simon called out, his heart racing. "Is that you, Jean?" There was no response, but Simon felt a cold breeze blowing against his face. He knew then that he was not alone in the alleyway. Suddenly, a figure appeared before him, the ghostly form of Jean, her eyes filled with sadness and despair. Simon felt a surge of fear wash over him, but he stood his ground, determined to face whatever was haunting the alleyway. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The ghostly Jean simply pointed towards the direction of where Simon had always drove her, the same derelict building where Simon had been dropping her off every night. Simon knew then that he had to investigate, to uncover the truth behind Jean's murder and put her spirit to rest. Simon's heart pounded in his chest as he stood in front of the apartment that had been Jean's destination for the past several nights. The rain fell heavily, casting an eerie light on the deserted street. He had a bad feeling about this, but he had to see it for himself. He took a deep breath and approached the unlocked glass door, slowly pushing it and making his way in. The apartment was dark and quiet, but Simon could feel the ghostly presence of Jean all around him. Suddenly, Jean appeared on the stairway. She slowly lifted her hand and pointed towards the direction where she wants Simon to go. Simon took a deep breath and slowly made his way up the stairs. His footsteps echoed throughout the silent night as he approached one of the units that Jean is standing at. He made his way to the front door and knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and musty interior. Simon hesitated, but curiosity got the best of him, and he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and Simon's nose wrinkled in disgust. He fumbled in his pocket for a flashlight and switched it on, casting a small beam of light into the gloom. The house was in disarray, with overturned furniture and broken glass littering the floor. Simon carefully made his way through the debris, shining his flashlight ahead of him. As he turned a corner, his light fell on a figure slumped against the wall. It was Jean's ex-boyfriend, his face twisted in terror, as if he had died of fright. Simon stood frozen in shock and fear, his heart racing as he stared at the lifeless body of Jean's ex-boyfriend. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and his mind struggled to make sense of the gruesome scene before him. The image of the man's terrified expression was burned into his memory, haunting him with its intensity. As he stood there, trying to collect himself, Simon saw Jean floating near the ceiling. In that moment, Jean's ghostly form began to fade away, finally finding the closure and justice that she had been seeking. Simon then fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the emergency number. As he waited for the police to arrive, Simon stood frozen in fear, his eyes never leaving the body on the floor. He couldn't believe that he had unknowingly been driving Jean to haunt his ex-boyfriend here for the past week. The police arrived in a flurry of activity, cordoning off the entire apartment and sealing it for investigation. Simon watched from a distance, his heart heavy with guilt and fear. He knew that he had unwittingly played a role in this horrific event. The following day, Simon went to check the drawer at his home where he usually keeps all the money he earns for the week. He has a weekly routine of visiting the bank, and today was no different. As he opened the drawer, he was taken aback to find that a considerable amount of the notes had turned into plain papers. It dawned on him that these were the notes that had been given to him by Jean. After the haunting experience with Jean, Simon couldn't shake off the fear that had taken over him. He found it hard to focus on driving at night, and his cheerful personality had turned into one of anxiety and fear. As much as he tried to convince himself that it was just a nightmare, the memory of finding Jean's ex-boyfriend's body still haunted him. Simon eventually made the tough decision to stop driving the night shift. He knew that it was the only way he could regain control over his life and sanity. Simon's taxi remained parked in his garage, gathering dust, as he found another job that suited him better. Although the memory of the girl in the rain still lingered in his mind, Simon found comfort in knowing that he had made the right decision for his mental health. The incident had taught him a valuable lesson about the fragility of life and the importance of being aware of the unseen forces that surround us. Simon had come out of the experience a changed man, forever haunted by the ghostly encounter he had with Jean.